Oh, how the mighty have fallen. The Assad dynasty, lasting 53 years, has collapsed. From the 24 years that Bashar al-Assad was in power, he spent the 13 dealing with the Syrian civil war, a civil war which was instigated and fueled by the Anglo-Saxons with the support of regional countries under the Western labeled Arab Spring. The HTS leader is now the new leader of Syria. Muhammad al-Golani is just his adoptive name. His real name is Ahmed al-Sarraj. He's a former ISIS member, actually the deputy leader to al-Zarqawi, the al-Qaeda leader in Iraq. And then he relocated, or rather he was sent to serve as deputy leader of ISIS in Syria. So let that sink in. The West and Israel have facilitated in putting the former deputy head of al-Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS in Syria in power in Damascus. The visuals the West tried to destroy are now the visuals they used to portray so-called opposition members and freedom fighters. Through a careful PR campaign crafted by the West and Israel, Mohammed al-Golani, who was designated as a terrorist by the US in 2013 and wanted for $10 million, as posted by the US Embassy in Syria back then, has been rebranded from radical jihadist to a khaki blazer-wearing Zelensky revolutionary. Praised by the West and even granted an interview on CNN the other night. He and his fellows are now rebranded as opposition leaders, opposition members, who, the jihadists of ISIS, who beheaded so many local population as well as Westerners. Let that sink in. Back in September 2022, CNN took a principled stance when Christiane Amanpour refused to wear a headscarf for an interview with the Iranian president. However, for Golani, a former ISIS al-Qaeda member and still on wanted lists, CNN abandons its principles and conducts the interview with the journalist wearing a headscarf. The British and French governments are welcoming the news of the Syrian regime fall, claiming that now is the time for unity. Unity under the ISIS fundamentalists. They're not saying that, but that's what it actually is. Germany expresses satisfaction also about the fall of the regime and urges the country must not fall into the hands of extremists. Another laughable comment. Meanwhile, the caretaker prime minister of Syria, appointed by Bashar al-Assad back in September, Mohammed Ghazi al-Jalali, has stated he will remain in power until elections. Al-Golani has confirmed in an interview to Al Arabiya network that he is in contact with the caretaker prime minister to ensure a smooth transition. He also addressed the Kurds, urging them to sever ties with foreign agencies, particularly the US, meaning a clear message he's obviously relaying from the Turks to the Kurds. At the same time, Turkish forces are actively attacking the Kurds. And speaking of Turkey, the foreign minister of Turkey, Hakan Fidan, has stated that Assad was not democratic, a true statement. Though, let's not forget that Turkey's own democracy has faced significant challenges. After the attempted coup against President Erdogan back in July 15, 2016, Erdogan implemented broad purges. Tens of thousands of people were detained, dismissed, or arrested, including from the judiciary, education, media, and other sectors, all on accusations of involvement in the coup or ties to the Gülenist movement. This led to a 2-year state of emergency that expanded government powers to crack down on dissent. These actions reshaped Turkey's political landscape and solidified Erdogan's control over both military and civilian institutions, hardly a democratic practice. Turkey's foreign minister also stated that Turkey's forces are committed to guaranteeing Syria's security. For those unfamiliar or not well versed with diplomatic language, this essentially means that Turkish forces will continue to occupy even more Syrian territory, adding to the 8% of the north they already control following their invasions of 2016, 18, and 19. The irony here in Fintan's assertion is that this new Syrian state, he says, will foster inclusion in society, a notion hard to take seriously when you consider how Turkey has treated Greeks, Assyrians, Kurds, and Armenians over the years. Under Assad, at least the Christian communities were not harmed. One can only fear how these populations will be treated now by the jihadists, who the West, I repeat, has conveniently rebranded as the opposition. In fact, the HTS has employed violent tactics and ethnic cleansing against the Druze, the Armenians, and the Christians with expulsions, forced demographic shifts, and destruction of property. But now, let's go back to how all this unfolded and discuss also the events on the ground as we speak, as well as my predictions or projections. So you see, the Assad regime fell quickly and relatively bloodlessly. One city after another was abandoned, especially when news circulated that Bashar al-Assad had likely already fled the country. Assad's forces were essentially destroyed within 10 days. Officers were seen taking off their military garb and blending in as civilians. The Iranians abandoned their embassy in Damascus, and similarly the Iraqis. In addition, the Iraqis have also now closed their borders with Syria to prevent jihadists from entering. Now, the Russians had left minimal forces on the ground in Syria, relying mainly on their naval and air capabilities. Hezbollah had been decimated by leadership losses and could not send significant numbers to fight alongside Assad. The Iranians did send some fighters from the Iraqi Shia militias, while the jihadists, supported by millions from Qatar and by Turkey, who through the years provided logistical support and trading. They were also supported by the Israeli Air Force, which had been bombing Assad's forces systematically for years now and intensified the campaign in the last 10 days as part of a broader strategy to target the Shia Crescent supply route from Iran through Iraq and Syria to Hezbollah. Now, it's evident that Assad was essentially abandoned by the Russians. If Russia wanted to stop the attacks, it could have used the advanced systems it possesses. After all, for 2.5 years, we've seen what's been happening in Ukraine. It could strike the command centers of the jihadists and Turkey's proxies remotely. Why hadn't it used its much publicized long-range missile, long-range weapons? I tend to believe that there's some level of coordination between the Russians and Trump. Putin appears poised to secure his objectives in Ukraine, while Trump seems to be getting what he has requested, possibly tied to his unique relationship with Israel, and how he wants Iran to be handled decisively upon his return to office. It makes no other sense for Putin to lose bases in the Eastern Mediterranean and act as if nothing is happening. Likely, a behind-the-scenes agreement allows Russia to retain its bases in the Mediterranean, particularly in Syria. Well, I mean, at least that's my objective assessment. Now, the jihadists have not entered Latakia, which is where the Russian air base is, neither Tartus, which is where their naval base is. The new government will decide what will happen with the bases, is what caretaker Prime Minister al-Jalali said. I remind you, he's been appointed as Prime Minister of Syria by Assad back in September. Lavrov has confirmed, Lavrov is the Foreign Minister of Russia, he has confirmed that the Russian ships are still in position. So Putin, by all accounts and observations, seems to be aligning with the US, effectively cutting off the Shia corridor to Lebanon. At the same time, Russia, the US, and Israel are baiting Erdogan, who, in the role of the useful fool, is doing all the heavy lifting, convinced he can achieve his neo-Ottoman dreams. Meanwhile, how does Israel plan to counter the threat of an Islamic caliphate forming on its northern borders? Well, through the Kurds. After Trump's treacherous withdrawal from the Kurdish areas, the US basically abandoned the Kurds. They were at the time fighting ISIS on America's behalf and had lost 11,000 fighters for this cause. He left the Kurds exposed. The Turks entered on 3 separate invasions in 2016, 18, and 19, bombing the region and establishing an occupation that corresponds to roughly 8 to 10% of the land in northern Syria. What is happening now is that with the Assad regime forces retreating and to prevent jihadists from entering, the Kurds have stepped in to fill in the gaps. The areas they've now seized, including Deir ez-Zor, extend further south to Abu Kamal on the Iraqi border. So the Kurds are taking over the areas essentially abandoned by the Assad regime forces. This establishes a de facto Kurdish border east of the Euphrates. As Kurdish commanders have stated, their goal is to ensure that the east of the Euphrates does not experience the chaos unfolding in the west of it. Now, Israel appears to be preparing a security zone that will connect with Kurdish territories, solidifying this strategic alignment. The Turkey-backed jihadists, after finishing with Assad, have now focused their attacks on the Kurds, especially in Manbij. Manbij is an ancient city, once known as Hierapolis during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. The area is now under siege, along with Turkish forces shelling it as well. Despite this, the Kurds are resisting fiercely against both the Turkish forces and the jihadists. The Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, are primarily composed of Kurdish fighters. They remain the only group that has successfully kept their regions secure. They actively protect minorities and secure as the key guarantors of stability in the area. So currently, Kurdish forces control around roughly 25 to 30% of Syria, a development widely seen as positive, though Turkey definitely disagrees. If the Druze region of Daraa were to connect with the Kurdish-controlled territories, it would create a strategic alignment viewed favorably by most parties, first and foremost, Israel, and least favored, of course, by Hezbollah and Turkey, as such a connection would completely sever Iraq, and by extension Iran, from having direct access to Hezbollah, and would also enrage Turkey, as they have always denied the right of the Kurds to self-determination. One must keep at the back of their mind that 20% of the indigenous Turkish population is ethnically Kurdish. I encourage you all to watch a 14-minute analysis I put out on the channel almost 3 weeks ago, when everyone's attention was on a possible Israel-Iran showdown. I came out and provided analysis on how I considered that Turkey and not Iran could be the one who would trigger an escalation for an all-out war, triggered by their attempts over the decades to quench any attempt by the Kurds for self-determination. I also, in that video, addressed the issue of the Druze and their role as envisioned by Israel in all of this scenario. The video is short and comprehensive, and I encourage you to listen to it. I'll provide a direct link to it in the description box below. So, before we end this video, we should note that Israel has further invaded the Golan Heights and occupied additional areas there, including the Quneitra province. So recapping, I believe that the Russians will likely keep their forces in Latakia and Tartus, while Iran is significantly weakened. Iran is the clear loser in this situation. The land connection it had with Hezbollah has completely been severed. Instead, the corridor has now been reversed. It's been reversed from Israel to Iran, enabled by uniting the Druze region of Daraa with the Kurdish regions of Syria and Iraq. This is a move of high strategic importance, leaving Iran compelled to negotiate some form of agreement. If this analysis holds, it suggests that the Americans and the Russians have actually opened up a channel of communication and mutual understanding. I want to end my analysis in that it's becoming increasingly clear and concerning that an Israeli strike on Iran is imminent, especially with the return of Trump to office. Iran is bracing for a second, far more intense attack, as it appears Trump has given his tacit approval for such an operation. At this critical juncture, the Iranian regime is focused on its survival, fully aware that Israel, with Trump's backing, seems determined to dismantle it. Bibi, anyway, has been professing this for 20 years now. So, what do you think? Drop a comment below, share your analysis and views on the monumental historic changes the region of the Middle East is experiencing that will have far-reaching global reverberations. I thank you for all the well-meaning, supportive comments regarding the info I put out there. All right then, so if you found today's video interesting, press subscribe and like, and hit the notification bell to always be alerted whenever we drop new content, and share around with people who are as inquisitive as you. I really, really appreciate you all. And today I'm going to leave you again with this. Please spread kindness, compassion, and love to yours, to those around you, and to strangers. They are much, much needed in the world. Goodbye for now.